The screen is black. A faint bell tolls. The sound of distant weeping echoes under whispered Latin prayers. A voice breaks the silence, measured, grave, unmistakably final. They were never meant to be found. 23 women, erased. Not by accident, not by time, but by design. You've heard of haunted convents. You've heard stories of cruel mother superiors and suspicious deaths, but this isn't a ghost story. This is a machine, one built inside sacred walls, powered by obedience, veiled by prayer, and fueled by the flesh of the faithful. Between 1854 and 1862, 23 nuns disappeared from St. Mary's Convent in Wisconsin. On paper, they were reassigned. In whispered rumors, they were called to God, but behind stone walls and candlelit corridors, their bodies were never found, and their souls, if you still believe in such things, were offered to something far older than any church. The Catholic diocese has spent more than a century burying the truth. The Vatican called it clerical misfiling. Historians labeled it folklore. But you are not here for stories. You're here for truth. Truth that stains. Truth that scars. The kind of truth that makes good men never sleep the same way again. A sealed cavity in the convent wall, found during recent renovations, revealed letters, ledgers, and something else. A small silver crucifix still wet with blood that wasn't old. The church has since reclassified the building, declared the findings private property, and filed injunctions against further excavation. But the records have already been copied, the letters decoded, the rituals translated. Tonight, I'm going to show you what they were hiding. Not to entertain you, not to scare you, but to awaken something they buried in you long ago. You were born into a system that rewards submission, a world where obedience is currency, and your ignorance is their fortress. This story is not about missing women, it's about how the innocent are harvested when institutions serve something older than salvation. This is the convent of horrors, and you've just stepped into its shadow. Cut to black. The tolling bell fades. The descent begins. St. Mary's was never just a convent, it was a fortress, built not to protect the world from sin, but to contain something far worse within. On the surface it appeared noble, Gothic arches, hand-carved pews, black-clad nuns tending gardens and orphans. But beneath the rituals and hymns lay something ancient and calculated, not faith, not devotion, control. In 1854, Bishop William Quarter selected the estate for a reason that had nothing to do with spiritual mission. The land had a history. Before it was consecrated, it belonged to a Germanic cult that fled Europe after their order was excommunicated in 1839. Locals said the trees never grew right on that soil, that compasses spun useless, that children disappeared near the woods. But the church needed a foothold in the Midwest, and power always chooses terrain with a memory. When Mother Catherine Murphy arrived, she brought more than her Bible. Her Eastern convent was known for strict asceticism, but also whispered about in theological circles, for experimenting with unorthodox penance rituals, flagellation, sleep deprivation, isolation. The church silenced the rumors with commendations. That's what it does with useful monsters. Catherine's first order of business at St. Mary's was to install iron rings into the floor of the chapel cellar. Officially, they were for storing food barrels, but the cellar was never used for storage. The stone beneath it had been hollowed long ago, older than the foundation, carved with symbols even Rome couldn't decipher. Some resembled runes. Others matched carvings found in suppressed scrolls from the Vatican secret archives, fragments labeled as non-canonical and sealed under orders of Pope Clement XIV. What Catherine sought wasn't salvation, it was sovereignty, not over land but over minds. She wasn't building a convent, she was building a laboratory. The nuns weren't disciples, they were variables in a divine experiment no man had consented to. And those who vanished? They weren't taken. They were used. Used to open doors not meant to be opened. Used to offer purity to an entity that fed on obedience, silence, and submission. Each disappearance was a ritual, each prayer a binding. The church knew, the local diocese knew. But knowledge isn't what they protect. They protect the system. You've been taught that holy ground is safe. But that's the first lie they fed you. Next, I'll show you the second. From the beginning, the disappearances were choreographed like sacraments, silent, sacred, and irreversible. The nuns were not taken in rage or chaos or error. They were chosen, ritualized, removed with precision. It always began the same way, a whisper of reassignment, a claim of distant missions. No goodbyes, no farewells, just an empty bed and a name never spoken again. Mother Catherine's voice would carry the announcement at breakfast, calm as a liturgy. Sister Margaret has been called, or the bishop has reassigned Sister Agnes to Dakota. Always just enough truth to silence doubt, always just enough fear to stop questions from forming. But there were no records of these transfers, no trains, no letters, no official orders from the archdiocese. Only silence. And the silence was enforced. You have to understand what silence means inside a convent. It's not just quiet. It's discipline. It's hierarchy. It's a code of survival where obedience becomes instinct and hesitation becomes heresy. When you're told not to speak, you don't just obey. You forget how to form the words. That's how the system survives. Mother Catherine ensured it. She rewrote the rhythm of their lives. Morning bells now rang with dread. Meals were eaten in absolute silence. The once gentle recitations of psalms became cold, mechanical chants. Sisters who dared comfort one another were reassigned to isolation. Penance became punishment. Discipline became control. Control became doctrine. Sister Josephine Brady once spoke out. Once. She questioned the disappearance of her closest companion, Sister Clare, during a quiet hour in the garden. By nightfall, Josephine was bound in the cellar, forced to kneel for 9 hours while reciting psalms over dried beans. She emerged pale, bleeding, broken, and would not speak again for weeks. The message was clear. Questions had consequences. And yet I were always watching. Those who disappeared often shared a pattern. Youth, beauty, gentleness, innocence, traits that made them desirable. Not to God, but to something older, darker, and less merciful. Because at the heart of St. Mary's was not redemption. It was transaction. Piety was harvested, innocence sold. And in the hidden chamber beneath the chapel, deals were sealed in blood and sealed in silence. This wasn't a convent, it was a supply chain. And the church? It was the logistics arm of something far worse. By the spring of 1856, the air inside St. Mary's had changed. It wasn't just the scent of damp stone or the fading incense that clung to the chapel walls. It was something colder, heavier, like the building itself had begun to breathe, and it was watching. The older nuns kept their heads low, their eyes lower. The younger ones were vanishing too quickly for questions to grow roots. Sister Elizabeth, once beloved for her motherly kindness, now walked the halls like a warden, her soft voice hollowed into monotone recitations of duty and sacrifice. Sister Margaret, always precise in her medicinal practice, became secretive. Herbs were now locked away, tinctures prepared behind closed doors, and in her eyes, that was no longer science, that was alchemy, a controlled poisoning of innocence. Mother Catherine rarely appeared during the day. Her footsteps echoed mostly at night, slow, deliberate, sometimes stopping outside certain doors long enough to steal breath from a sleeping chest. One novice wet herself waiting for those footsteps to pass. The next morning she was reassigned. No goodbye, no name spoken. And yet, despite the suffocating dread, life outside the convent carried on. Local farmers continued to drop off milk and eggs. Townsfolk came to Mass, moved by the beauty of the Latin chants, echoing from the stained glass chapel. None suspected that was the genius of it. You see, darkness doesn't operate in chaos. It thrives in order, predictability, clean robes, smiling faces, polished pews. While the flock sees ritual, the predator sees opportunity. And then, there were the visitors. Once a month, well-dressed men arrived in horse-drawn carriages, never more than 2 at a time. Not priests, not parishioners, always out of town, always silent. They were escorted by Mother Catherine herself through the north wing, off-limits to all but senior staff. After they left, Sister Margaret's infirmary would receive new donations, medical crates from cities the nuns had never visited, vials labelled in languages none of them spoke. Sister Mary Collins once caught a glimpse through a cracked door. She saw one of the visitors place a gold coin into Sister Elizabeth's palm, a heavy, ancient-looking coin. She never saw it again. This was no longer about faith, it was commerce. And in this system, virginity had a price, and salvation was never the product. Sister Mary Collins learned to listen with her eyes. Silence had become survival. Every sideways glance, every hesitation in a prayer, every forced smile at the evening meal spoke louder than words ever could. The convent had become a theatre of shadows. What wasn't said was always more important than what was. She began to notice the patterns, not just the disappearances, but the timing. Each vanishing happened within days of one of the men in black coats visiting, always at night, always when the chapel candles burned later than usual, and always followed by Sister Margaret preparing strange elixirs deep in the infirmary, her hands shaking slightly as she worked. Sister Mary wasn't the only one who noticed. Sister Clare O'Donnell, a soft-spoken girl from County Clare, had kept a quiet journal. It was hidden in the gap beneath her mattress, pages filled with trembling observations, names, dates, odd smells from the north wing, and mentions of nighttime footsteps that didn't match the familiar pace of any nun. She wrote in code, a crude one, but Sister Mary deciphered it quickly. On the final page, a chilling phrase, "They take only the beautiful ones." Then a date. Then nothing more. Claire vanished 3 days later. Mother Catherine announced she'd succumbed to tuberculosis and had been buried quietly to avoid scandal. But there was no funeral mass, no grave marker, and Sister Mary had seen her alive just hours before the announcement, pale, yes, but smiling faintly as she folded altar linens with shaking hands. That's when Mary stopped praying for deliverance. She started planning. She began to map the hallways by sound, tracking the creaks, the groans of wood and stone. She traced the cold draughts that crept under the doors of forbidden rooms. She memorized the footsteps, Catherine's slow and certain, Margaret's clipped and anxious, Elizabeth's light and cold like a surgeon. One night, during a routine cleaning assignment, she slipped a matchstick between the hinges of the forbidden cellar door. The next morning, it was gone. Not broken, removed. Someone knew she had tried. That night, a slip of paper was left on her pillow. No signature, just a phrase. "Curiosity is a sin, Sister Mary. But sins can be forgiven, if confessed quickly." The game had changed. She wasn't just watching them anymore. They were watching her. She stopped sleeping after that. Sister Mary lay each night in her narrow cot, staring at the ceiling, listening. Every whisper of wind against the window became a breath. Every shift of wood became a footstep. The convent that had once felt like stone now pulsed like a living thing, breathing, twitching, waiting, and always watching. She kept her hands tightly wrapped in her bedsheet, afraid they might tremble and betray her. She couldn't afford weakness, not now, not when her name had joined the list. She could feel it. The way Mother Catherine's pale eyes lingered, the way Sister Margaret stopped smiling when they passed in the corridor, the way Sister Elizabeth offered her tea that tasted wrong. She never drank it. Instead, she began fasting in secret, not as penance, but as protest. She no longer trusted their food, their water, their sacraments. If the Eucharist could be corrupted, if even the body of Christ could become a tool of silence, what sanctuary remained? She began slipping notes into hymnals, Latin phrases bent into code, lines like Agnus Dei non responde. The Lamb of God does not answer. She didn't know if anyone saw them, but the act itself was resistance. It reminded her that she still had a voice, even if she never spoke aloud again. Then one night, everything shifted. She was assigned to clean the north wing, a task normally reserved for senior staff. No explanation, no witnesses, just a brass key placed on her dinner tray without a word. The message was clear. They were either testing her or preparing her. She took it. What she found inside the forbidden wing wasn't a hallway. It was a tomb. The corridor beyond the door was lined with discarded belongings, shoes, shawls, rosaries, laid out like offerings. Dust coated everything. The air was thick, not with age, but with sorrow, a spiritual rot that seeped into the skin. She counted vent doors on either side, all locked, all cold. But at the far end, beneath an arched stone carved with unfamiliar symbols, a single door stood slightly ajar. From within came a sound she could not name. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal, it was a low, rhythmic hum, like something ancient breathing through the walls. She turned back that night, but something followed her out. Not footsteps, not whispers, something older, something that had been waiting to be seen. Something had changed in her after that night, not just in her mind but in her body. A weight pressed behind her eyes, a coldness that refused to leave her bones. Her hands trembled in chapel. Her breath fogged the air when no one else seemed cold. She was becoming something else, or perhaps something else was becoming her. She began hearing things no one else reacted to, a chant humming beneath the choir's psalms. A voice layered beneath the Latin prayers, speaking no language known to men. It wasn't hallucination, it was memory, not hers, but the building's. St. Mary's was remembering. She knew now that the convent wasn't a sanctuary, it was a machine, an ancient one, a device dressed in limestone and stained glass, engineered not for worship, but for conversion. Not of faith, but of flesh. Every wall was a circuit, every ritual a key, and every nun who vanished was a sacrifice, fuel to keep the machine alive. They were never transferred, never sent away. They were taken below, not just by Mother Catherine, but by what she served. Because there is something older than the church hidden beneath its robes, an inheritance passed down from the blood cults of Rome through the cloisters of medieval Europe. Buried in catacombs beneath cathedrals, the faithful kneel in every Sunday, a hidden priesthood that never died. It simply changed vestments. And at St. Mary's, it had found fertile ground. Mother Catherine wasn't a zealot, she was a gatekeeper, and Sister Margaret, a pharmacist of compliance. Sister Elizabeth, a mother not to children, but to an industry. Mary understood now. This wasn't about faith. This was about economy. An old one that required purity to be harvested, obedience to be broken, and innocence to be prepared. Like meat. The ancient hum in the north wing. It wasn't a metaphor. It was real. A vibration that altered perception, that weakened resistance, that whispered truths too old to be put into words. Mary stopped praying, not because she no longer believed in God, but because she realized he wasn't the one being worshipped here, not in this place, not under this roof, not with these rituals. And when she opened her eyes at dawn, she found something written on her wall in ash. "We see you now." The message on the wall vanished by morning, not erased, not cleaned, gone, as if it had never existed. But the scent of burnt cloth lingered in her cell, and her pillow. It had been turned over, though she hadn't moved. Something had been there, watching, close enough to touch. She didn't report it. There was no one to report it to. At St. Mary's, confession had become a trap. Sins whispered through the lattice of the confessional were no longer forgiven. They were documented. An inventory of leverage. Mary remembered Sister Clare's sudden fast after confessing impure thoughts. 3 days without food. whispers of sleep deprivation, then gone, always gone. It became clear, obedience wasn't sanctity, it was currency. And control, that was the true sacrament. The Church has always known this. For centuries, it has clothed domination in divinity, guilt as a leash, shame as a collar, discipline as devotion. In convents like St. Mary's, that system was perfected. Young women stripped of identity, renamed, re-robed, reprogrammed. Families left behind, histories erased, bodies surrendered. And once the soul was compliant, the body became available. Mary kept pretending, reciting prayers, following the bells, smiling when watched. But her mind was no longer theirs. She moved like a ghost in her own skin, silently mapping corridors, counting keys, memorizing guard patterns. But the longer she played this role, the more something inside her shifted. She began dreaming in Latin. Not church Latin, not scripture, something older, rougher. Tongues that predated Rome, carved into stone, chanted in darkness, invoked by blood. She would wake with scratches on her arms, bruises she couldn't explain, symbols drawn in condensation on her window. And always, that hum beneath the floorboards. One night, during Compline, she felt it vibrate through her spine, a deep pulsins, tone that made her vision blur and her heart skip. The other sisters continued praying, unfazed, but Mary watched their mouths. They were no longer moving. The sound was controlling them. She realized then, this wasn't possession, it was programming. A ritual algorithm buried beneath centuries of liturgy, a frequency of obedience, a harmonic key to the human mind, the chants, the bells, the fasting, all elements of a larger mechanism. One built not to save souls, but to condition them. She wasn't in a convent. She was inside a cathedral of control. The realization shattered her. Not instantly, not with a scream or tears, but quietly, like frost creeping across glass. Her faith, once the foundation of her life, now cracked with every breath she took inside those walls. St. Mary's had not failed God, it had replaced him. And in his place, something older had been enthroned. The rituals she had cherished, the prayers she had whispered since girlhood, they weren't acts of worship. They were acts of submission, designed to train her body, to bypass reason, to deaden resistance, to prepare her for use. That's when she stopped folding her hands in prayer. She clenched them into fists instead. There were still 12 of them, 12 junior sisters. The number struck her, biblical, deliberate, like everything else here. A symbolic echo of the apostles, but inverted, a mockery, a dozen lambs fattened for slaughter, each one chosen not for her piety, but for what could be extracted from her flesh. Mary began watching the others more closely. Sister Imelda, the youngest, had begun waking with blood on her nightgown, nosebleeds that no one treated. Sister Rose, once talkative, now spoke only in whispers and jumped at her own shadow. Sister Lucia had shaved her head, unprompted, murmuring something about the crown of thorns inside. And then there was Sister Helen. Sister Helen had once been joyful, a singer. Her voice had lifted the chapel like sun through stained glass. Now she only stared at the crucifix during Mass, tears streaming silently down her face, lips unmoving. She was next. Mary could feel it. One night, as they scrubbed the stone floor of the apothecary, Helen leaned in close and whispered without moving her lips. "They take the voice first." Mary didn't reply. She couldn't, not without breaking her mask, but that moment confirmed it. She wasn't the only one awake. Others felt the presence, sensed the pattern, feared the same outcome. But fear is what kept them apart. The system thrived on isolation, each nun made to believe she was the only one questioning, the only one doubting, the only one afraid. It was a lattice of loneliness, woven so tightly that no one could break through. But Mary was done being silent. She began her own liturgy. Not of fear, but of rebellion. Rebellion, she learned, didn't begin with fire. It began with attention. Mary started listening not just to the surface of things, but to the patterns beneath, the silences between bells, the slight delay before Sister Elizabeth repeated a command, the flicker in Sister Margaret's eyes when anyone mentioned the garden's locked shed. There was an order to it all, mathematical, ritualistic, precise. Control wasn't applied haphazardly, it was administered like medicine, in doses, measured, timed, hidden behind the veil of religious order. But once Mary saw the formula, she couldn't unsee it. That's when she began experimenting. She stayed one breath behind during prayers. She knelt 1 second late. She skipped one word in the liturgy. Tiny ruptures, imperceptible to most. But within days, she began to see who noticed. Sister Margaret would glance at her longer. Sister Elizabeth would grip her shoulder during instruction, just a little too tightly. And Mother Catherine, she would tilt her head slightly during Mass, like a predator catching the scent of something foreign. Mary knew she was marked, but she also knew something else now. They feared attention. They thrived when eyes were closed, when minds were docile, when obedience was mistaken for virtue. But when watched, truly watched, they hesitated. Even the great machine of control requires secrecy to function. Exposure was its only weakness. So she started writing again. Not letters this time, but copies. She began transcribing her memories, the names of the vanished, the dates of their departures, the conversations she overheard, the strange symbols above the chapel door. She stitched these writings into the lining of her habit, hid pages inside the hollow of her prayer bench, wrapped a list of missing names around the base of her candle. If she vanished next, someone had to know. She even began praying, again, not to the God of the convent, but to something deeper, the raw force of truth, the unflinching light that dissolves illusion. She didn't ask for salvation. She asked for clarity and strength, and, if necessary, vengeance. Then one night, the bell for matins didn't ring. Instead, a low chime echoed through the halls, deep, metallic, unfamiliar. It wasn't a call to prayer. It was a summons. Only certain nuns rose from their beds. Mary watched them move. Mary didn't follow them, not yet. She stayed in the shadows, heart pounding, counting every silent footstep as the procession disappeared into the forbidden corridor. The north wing, long sealed under the guise of renovation, now yawned open like a wound, a place of mystery, no longer hidden, merely ignored. She waited until the hall was clear, then crept after them. Her bare feet barely made a sound on the cold stone floor. The further she walked, the colder the air grew. Not natural cold, but deep, internal, ancestral, the kind of cold that touched bone and memory. Candles lined the walls, though no hands had lit them. Their flames burned blue. The hall bent sharply left, then down, descending by steps carved directly into the limestone. The architecture changed. No longer convent stone and Gothic arch, but something older, cruder, pagan. Symbols unfamiliar to Mary, circles, spirals, eyes, had been etched into the stone by fingers that must have bled. She knew instinctively this was not part of the church's design. This was part of something that had been waiting before the church ever arrived. At the base of the stairs, she saw the chamber. A circular room, 12 pillars, 12 nuns kneeling at their base, motionless, eyes rolled back, whispering in unison. Not in Latin, not even in words. A pulsing drone, a throat-borne vibration that shook the candle flames. At the center of the circle stood Mother Catherine. She had removed her veil. Her hair was not white or grey, but black and thick and strangely wet, as though soaked in oil. Her face, always pale, now glistened with sweat and something darker. Her eyes no longer held human whites, only the same soft blue glow that lit the room. Beside her stood Sister Margaret and Sister Elizabeth, silent, unblinking, holding objects Mary couldn't immediately identify. But when Elizabeth lifted hers, a ceremonial bowl, card, Out from what looked like bone, Mary saw it. A single lock of red hair floated in the water. Agnes's hair. They were performing a rite, a collection ritual. Each girl brought here was part of a ledger, recorded, tithed, extracted. Mary watched in horror as Catherine raised her hands and began the invocation, a soundless chant that made Mary's teeth ache. She wasn't witnessing heresy. She was witnessing harvest. Mary could barely breathe. Not from fear, though it clutched at her throat, but from the pressure in the room itself. The air was dense, saturated with presence. Not God, not the devil, but something older, hungrier. It watched through every flickering flame and whispered through the gaps in every wordless chant. This was no convent. It was a conduit. The 12 nuns, still kneeling, swayed in rhythm now, their mouths agape, their hands raised in silent offering, and between their palms hovered objects, tokens, pieces, remnants, a braid of hair, a bloodied cloth, a rosary blackened with ash, sacrifices. The chamber pulsed once, then again, like the heartbeat of something buried. Mother Catherine stepped into the center, her bare feet stained red. Around her, the floor bore symbols carved so deep the grooves seemed to glow. She extended both arms as Sister Margaret placed a thin knife across her open palms. It shimmered, not with metal, but with memory, the kind of blade that had tasted centuries. Mary wanted to flee, to run back through the dark halls, past the chapel, into the forest and away. But something deeper kept her rooted. Not curiosity, not bravery, truth, raw, terrible truth. She had to see. Mother Catherine began to speak, not aloud, but within. The words hit Mary's skull like hammer blows, not language, but instruction, direct input, a kind of psychological override bypassing thought entirely. The voice is taken, the body is conditioned, the essence is consumed. Mary gripped the stone wall to steady herself as nausea rose. They weren't just trafficking bodies, they were processing them, extracting something unseen, something essential. That's when she saw it. In the corner of the chamber, veiled in shadows, stood a second altar. Smaller, simpler. Upon it, 3 glass vials, each glowing faintly, blue, red, gold. Sister Agnes, Sister Bernadette, S. Sister Teresa. Essence. Extracted, labeled, stored. The realization cracked something open inside Mary. This wasn't a cult experimentation, it was a system, an ancient machine designed to harvest purity, pain, and devotion, then convert it into something valuable, something saleable. The nuns weren't being sent away, they were being drained. Behind her, the door creaked. Someone else had entered the passage. She turned and met the eyes of Sister Elizabeth. But the woman who stood there now wasn't Elizabeth anymore. It wore Elizabeth's face, but it was not Elizabeth. Her once kind eyes were now voids, not black, not blue, voids, as if someone had scooped out her soul and left the illusion of form behind. Her smile, which used to warm the orphanage halls, now curled upward in a parody of comfort, like a doll-maker's idea of compassion. Mary froze. Not out of fear, but calculation. She knew in that moment that Elizabeth, this thing, could not yet tell she had seen everything, the ritual, the vials, the blueprint behind the lies. If she could mask her terror just long enough, she might still survive the night. Sister Mary, the figure cooed, voice soft as silk wrapped around a blade. Why are you not in chapel? The bells rang. Mary forced her knees to shake, her voice to quiver. I was lost. I followed the candles thinking they led to matins. Elizabeth stepped closer, her feet making no sound. Her shadow, however, moved independently, stretching sideways across the wall, twitching in spasms that didn't match her motion. Poor dear, she whispered. These old halls can be so disorienting after midnight. Her hand reached forward, not to strike but to touch, gently, to brand. Mary flinched as the fingers brushed her forehead. Not skin, not bone, something flexible and cold, like leather soaked in brine. A pulse throbbed beneath it. "There now," Elizabeth said, the smile deepening. "You'll remember the path next time." Mary nodded, eyes downcast. Submission, subtle, practiced. But inside, a fire had been lit. She turned and walked back up the corridor. Slowly, carefully, never showing her back to Elizabeth until the first bend obscured them from one another. And then she ran. Not to the dormitory, to the candle alcove behind the chapel, to her hidden writings, to the map she'd begun sketching of the underground halls etched carefully into the back of a discarded hymn. Null page. She traced her finger across it now, matching memory to paper. The north wing, the altar chamber, the second door. There was another passage, one even the sisters didn't seem to use, a disused wine cellar sealed after a fire decades ago. Father Ryan had mentioned it once in passing during Mass. If she could reach it, she might escape with the truth, but escape wouldn't be enough anymore. She had to burn the system. Mary no longer thought like a novice, she thought like a spy behind enemy lines. Everything was suspect now. The food, the bells, the prayers themselves. The words of Scripture had once been comfort. Now they felt coded, designed not to uplift but to bind, not to guide but to program. What had once been obedience now felt like a virus, and she'd been infected for years. She knew the timing of the halls, the rotation of the guards, if you could even call them that. Sisters no longer moved like women. They glided, watched, reported. The veil was both literal and strategic, eyes hidden, emotions erased. But Mary had something they didn't. She remembered who she was before the convent, before the silence, before the surrender. She was the daughter of a stonemason and a mother who read forbidden books by candlelight. She knew how to climb fences without creaking a hinge. She knew how to lie without blinking. And she knew, more than anything, that sometimes, to protect the innocent, a woman must become dangerous. By the next dusk, she was ready. She skipped Compline, faking illness. Sister Margaret barely glanced at her when she reported her migraine. She was no longer considered a threat. That would be their mistake. By moonrise, she had slipped into the shadowed corridor outside the sealed wine cellar. The door was old, iron-bound, and etched with forgotten symbols, worn by time, but not erased. She pressed her palm to its center, half expecting it to burn. Instead, it yielded. The door creaked open, and the air inside was alive. Not with spirit, with memory, old memory. Rows of shelves lined the chamber, jars, boxes, fragments, names etched in Latin, tags written in faded ink, each item catalogued, recorded like inventory in a warehouse, bones of unknown saints, teeth, cloth, skin, even tongues, preserved in fluid too dark to be water. It wasn't just a convent, it was a repository. A centuries-old vault for spiritual contraband, evidence of rituals perfected long before America was even a whisper in Europe's ear. And at the far wall, behind a curtain of cobwebs, she saw it. A second altar, not for worship, but for resistance. It bore a mark she hadn't seen before, a flame inside a circle crossed by a blade. Below it, a single phrase carved into stone, "Speak." And the silence shatters. Her fingers trembled as they traced the words. Speak, and the silence shatters. It wasn't a prayer. It was a command. A weapon embedded in language, a ritual phrase carved for the desperate, the hunted, the ones who knew the system was a cage. Mary looked around, breath shallow. This place was older than St. Mary's, older than the church itself, not sacred, but sanctified by rebellion. A secret altar, a defiant echo. Whoever carved those words had once stood where she now stood, terrified, cornered, awakening. On the altar sat 3 items, a bundle of dried herbs bound in red twine, a parchment scroll in an unfamiliar tongue, and a mirror, small, cracked, wrapped in a strip of linen embroidered with the same flame blade symbol. She picked it up, carefully. When she unwrapped the cloth and looked into the glass, she gasped. Her reflection stared back, but the chapel veil was gone. Her habit was shredded. Her eyes, no longer the gentle brown she had always known, were burning gold. Her lips were moving, though she made no sound. Then a voice whispered from within the glass. Not hers. "You are the last echo of the first scream." Mary dropped the mirror, heart pounding, but it didn't shatter. She stared at it, chest heaving. The message was clear. Whatever this was, this altar, this relic, this room, it wasn't designed for prayer. It was designed for activation. She wrapped the mirror back in the cloth, tied the herbs to her belt, and tucked the scroll beneath her tunic. Then she turned to leave, but froze. Footsteps. Not many. Just one. Slow, measured. Sister Margaret. Her shadow stretched across the cellar's wall before she appeared, a tall silhouette framed by flickering torchlight. In her hand, something gleamed. Not a candle. A scalpel. "Oh, Mary." Margaret's voice was almost maternal, almost. "You really should have stayed obedient." Mary didn't respond. She backed toward the altar, fingers tightening around the mirror like a blade. Margaret stepped into full view, her smile soft and surgical. "I know what you took, and I know what it means, but knowledge is insufficient." She raised the scalpel, pointing it like a conductor's baton. "They always scream," she said gently. "Even the faithful ones." Mary exhaled slowly. "No," she whispered, "not this time." And then she spoke. Not English, not Latin, but the ancient words on the scroll. The silence shattered. The words rolled from her tongue like thunder muffled in velvet, old, sharp syllables carved from a language that predated fear. She didn't know their meaning, but she understood their purpose. They weren't meant to be interpreted. They were meant to unmake control. Sister Margaret flinched, not from the volume, there was none, but from the resonance. Her hand trembled, the scalpel fell, clinking against the stone floor like a symbol of fallen authority. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Her eyes flickered, not with emotion, but with static. A glitch in the mask. The creature that wore Margaret's skin stumbled backward, knocking over a shelf of jars. Glass shattered. Dark fluid oozed out across the stones like spilled blood and ink. From the altar behind Mary, the mirror pulsed once, gold light slicing through the dark like judgment. Mary didn't stop. The chant continued. With each word, she felt something tear inside her, not painfully but necessarily. A shedding of veil after veil. The novice, the obedient daughter, the girl who begged for God's approval, all burned away, and in their place stood something older, harder, clearer. Sister Margaret tried to speak, finally. You don't know what you're doing." But Mary's voice drowned her out now, louder than the bells, older than confession. She finished the chant, and silence rushed in like a gasp from the earth itself. Then the floor began to hum. From the stone beneath the altar came a deep vibration, not shaking but vibrating, like a great engine reawakening after centuries of slumber. The torches flickered out, not from wind but from submission, and then a line of flame carved itself along the far wall, straight, deliberate, purposeful. The wall split open. Beyond it, darkness. Not absence, depth. Stairs descended into what looked like the earth's own marrow. Mary stepped toward them, Grice tapping the wrapped mirror, the herbs, and the parchment. Behind her, Sister Margaret knelt, gasping. "What are you?" she choked. Mary paused at the threshold of descent. Her voice was calm, cold, clarified. "Not your sister," she said. "Not anymore." Then she descended. each step echoing not just in the cellar but in her blood. Each step a renunciation of chains, of submission, of spiritual enslavement. This was no longer escape, this was initiation. The stairwell narrowed as she descended, carved not by modern tools but by hands, scraping, gouging, shaping the stone with purpose. The walls were smooth from age, sweat-polished by those who had come before. There were no torches, yet Mary could see, not with her eyes, but with something else. An interior light, awakened when the chant ended. A voice echoed softly in her mind. Not every dungeon is a prison. Some are wombs. The air grew warmer, but it wasn't the heat of fire. It was memory. Generational memory. The further she went, the more she remembered. Not events from her life, but truths embedded in the marrow of her soul. Like how to walk in darkness without fear, how to speak to stone, how to recognize the scent of blood that was never spilt in violence, but in oath. At the base of the stairs was a chamber, massive, hollowed out like a cathedral swallowed by the earth itself. 12 pillars formed a circle around a raised platform. Symbols carved into them pulsed faintly in hues no spectrum could define, part red, part gold, part violet. In the center stood a stone basin, full, but not with water. It was thicker, not blood, not oil, something in between. The scroll in her tunic grew warm. She removed it, unrolled it, and read the final line, "Drink, and memory becomes weapon." Her fingers hesitated for only a moment. Then she dipped them in the basin. The fluid clung like honey, humming with ancient intention. She brought it to her lips and drank. The taste was unlike anything earthly. Not sweet, not bitter, but truthful. And then it began. Visions hit her like thunder. A city of towers, burning. A woman in chains, smiling as they crowned her. A gathering of masked priests, chanting in a dead tongue beneath a moonless sky. A convent, not St. Mary's but older, built on the bones of an empire forgotten by textbooks and forbidden by Vatican. Archives, and one phrase repeating across them all, "When the last nun speaks, the first curse breaks." Mary collapsed to her knees, panting. When she rose, the light in her eyes had changed again, not gold, but black flame. She no longer belonged to the church, she belonged to the truth beneath it. Mary stood in the chamber, her breath steady now, her body still trembling but not from fear. That had been burned out of her, consumed in the visions, replaced with a quiet, lethal clarity. The basin behind her pulsed faintly, as if satisfied. The pillars no longer glowed. Their task, it seemed, was complete. She wasn't the same girl who had descended into the earth. She wasn't a girl at all. She was a weapon, awakened by memory. From above came a faint creak, floorboards, the familiar rhythm of habit shoes on stone. The sisters were moving again. Prayers, perhaps, or penances, or maybe searching. She turned toward the stairwell, wrapped the mirror in the linen cloth, tucked the parchment back into her tunic, and ascended. With each step, her thoughts sharpened. It was no longer enough to escape, no longer enough to expose. This needed to end. She emerged through the cellar door into the corridor of St. Mary's. The candles flickered in their sconces, and the distant bell tolled the start of Vespers. Voices echoed faintly from the chapel, Latin chants, mechanical and hollow. It no longer sounded like worship, it sounded like a spell, a containment ritual. Sister Elizabeth stood at the far end of the corridor, her hand raised as if about to knock on Mother Catherine's door. She turned, startled. "Mary." Her voice caught. She hadn't seen Mary since her descent. The girl before her now was not what she expected. "Where have you been?" Mary stepped forward, slowly, gaze unblinking. "I know." Elizabeth's face hardened. "You know what?" Mary tilted her head slightly, her voice calm. About the doctor, about the clients, about the women you sold, about the chapel under the floorboards, about what you and Margaret do when the others are praying. Elizabeth reached for something inside her sleeve. Mary didn't give her the chance. From beneath her tunic, she drew a handful of the herbs, the red-bound bundle from the altar, and threw it at Elizabeth's feet. Smoke erupted instantly, not white but deep violet, curling around the nun's legs like grasping fingers. Elizabeth screamed. It wasn't pain. It was recognition. "You opened it," she hissed. "You broke the silence." Mary stepped into the smoke, face inches from hers. "No," she whispered. "I answered it." And the corridor filled with wind, though no windows were open. The smoke coiled upward, thick and intelligent, wrapping Sister Elizabeth in tendrils that did not choke, but revealed. Her face, once soft with false maternal calm, twisted, not in pain, but in unmasking. Her eyes darkened, the skin around them hollowed. Beneath the habit was not merely a nun, it was something older, something willing. "You've no idea what you've trespassed into," Elizabeth hissed, voice rough with suppressed centuries. "This convent predates your church. We were here before the bishop ever saw a map." Mary didn't flinch. "And yet you hide behind his cross." Elizabeth lunged. Mary raised the mirror. In an instant, the smoke spiraled inward, sucked toward the mirror's surface like dust into a storm. Elizabeth shrieked, not in fear, but in defiance. "I was promised dominion." The mirror reflected not her face, but dozens. Every nun who had vanished. Sister Agnes, Sister Bernadette, even Sister Teresa. Faces screaming, then silenced, then burning with light. Elizabeth's body collapsed to the floor, boneless, empty. The habit lay flat as if its wearer had evaporated. Mary knelt and retrieved the rosary from around Elizabeth's remains. It was iron, too heavy for prayer, too cold for faith. "Not dominion," Mary whispered. "Just duration." She stood. From the far hallway came hurried steps. A door slammed open. Sister Margaret, eyes wide, face pale. "You've done it, haven't you?" she gasped. "You went down." Mary nodded. "I drank." Margaret stared at her, then at the mirror wrapped under Mary's arm. Her composure slipped. Her lips trembled, her fingers flexed with tremors of some internal war. For a moment, the veil dropped, and what looked out through Margaret's eyes was not human. "You shouldn't have been able to open it." Mary stepped forward, calm. "I remembered how." "You were never meant to remember," Margaret said through clenched teeth. "That's what the prayers are for. That's what the bells are for. They erase memory. That's the whole rhythm, so no one thinks long enough to unlock the gates again." Mary's voice was low and thunderous. "But someone always does." Margaret reached for a vial at her hip, something viscous and black. Mary was faster. With a flick of the mirror, she reflected Margaret's own face back at her, and screamed names. The names of the lost. The names of the silenced. The mirror pulsed. Margaret fell. The vial shattered, and the old foundation of St. Mary's began to crack. The sound was low at first, a groan beneath the stone floor, like an animal waking from centuries of sleep. Then the crack deepened. It spidered along the chapel wall, splitting the mural of the Virgin like a wound. Dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere above, a bell dislodged and fell, shattering against the flagstones with a scream of old iron. Mary stood still in the eye of the collapse, breathing slowly, her hands steady around the mirror. She wasn't afraid. She had already died once, back in the chamber below when she drank memory. What remained now was not a servant of God, but a keeper of reckoning. Sister Margaret's body lay still, her face frozen in a look of terror that no one had ever been allowed to see, until now. From the direction of the chapel, other nuns emerged, faces pale, habits disheveled. Sister Clare, Sister Ruth, Sister Helena. They gathered instinctively around the noise, drawn not just by fear, but by something breaking inside them. For years they'd lived under Mother Catherine's rule, under the iron shadow of silence, shame, penance. But silence was no longer possible. The walls themselves were confessing. Mary turned to them. "She's coming," she said simply. They knew who. The hallway doors blew open. Not with wind, but pressure. A presence entered first, then footsteps. Slow, certain. Measured like a metronome of obedience. Mother Catherine stepped into view, her black veil untouched by dust, her gaze unwavering. Her eyes, those pale, unnatural blue eyes, no longer pretended to be holy. Behind her trailed two figures, men in black coats, clean-shaven, with surgical gloves. Their faces were blank, administrative, like clerks of a morgue. "You should have stayed beneath," Mother Catherine said calmly. "You had a chance to forget." Mary's voice was clear. "I remembered everything. The girls, the vows, the sails, the hollow confessions, the tunnels, the foreign tongues you chant in secret." Mother Catherine raised one hand. A chant began, not from her lips, but from the men behind her. A language Mary didn't recognize, yet somehow understood. Not Latin, older, pre-human. The stone shook harder. The nuns behind Mary backed away. She didn't. She raised the mirror once more, this time not to reflect, but to reveal. Mother Catherine's true face flickered once, then fully unveiled, and even the loyal nuns began to scream. Mother Catherine did not blink. Her flesh shifted subtly, like fabric stretched over something far more angular beneath. Her face, once revered, began to flicker, not in light, but in essence, as if what looked out through her was borrowing skin to speak. Her eyes, once pale, now blazed with something ancient, not rage, not even disappointment, but contempt, the gaze of a being who had fed on generations. The men behind her did not move. Their chanting grew louder, faster, a rhythmless pounding of syllables that seemed to fracture thought itself. One of the younger nuns clutched her head and screamed, collapsing to the floor as if her skull could no longer contain the noise. Mary stepped forward. The mirror pulsed in her hand. Mother Catherine's voice dropped into something low and vibrating. It didn't echo, it reverberated inside the bones. "You think this is justice?" she said. "There is no justice, girl. Only order, only obedience, only systems. What you call evil is simply the cost of stability." Mary raised the mirror. The glass began to swirl, not reflecting but absorbing the flickering image of Catherine's face. Vein by vein, wrinkle by wrinkle, it peeled the disguise away. And then they saw her. Not just Mary. All of them. The remaining sisters, the ones who had feared and obeyed, now stared, mouths slack, as the figure of Mother Catherine collapsed inward, revealing a creature not bound by cloth or creed. She was tall, taller than human, skin like stretched parchment, hands that ended not in fingers but implements, one like a scalpel, another like an old quill. Her habit wasn't clothing, it was ritual binding, threads woven from contracts, not cloth, and around her throat, hung from hooks of bone, were rosaries made from human teeth. Still she spoke, though her mouth no longer moved. "We gave them purpose. We turned their suffering into structure. Without us, they were nothing." Mary answered, her voice steady, resonating now with the tone of something deeper than prayer. "They were souls." The mirror exploded in light. It wasn't fire. It was memory, projected, weaponized, holy. Images flooded the chapel. Sister Agnes tending a sick child. Sister Teresa reading scripture in the dark. Sister Bernadette singing softly to calm orphans. All gone, all taken, and now returned. The creature screamed. Not in pain, in loss. Its harvest was being undone. The chapel lights pulsed unnaturally as the mirror's shattered remains levitated, orbiting Mary like shards of consecrated memory. Each fragment glowed, illuminating visions trapped within. Flashes of the missing nuns, their final moments, their stolen dignity, and the silent betrayals that erased them from history. Mother Catherine, or what now stood in her place, staggered backward. Her talon-like hands reached for the chanting men, but they were no longer present in mind. Their mouths moved, but their eyes were blank, now consumed by the very syllables they had spoken. The ritual had turned inward, it was devouring its hosts. A wind without origin surged through the chapel, candles extinguished, the crucifix above the altar cracked, splitting down the middle like a verdict passed from heaven itself. The remaining sisters dropped to their knees, not in worship, but in awakening. Their minds, once shackled by ritual repetition, now burned with clarity. They remembered whispered names, half-heard sobs at midnight, belongings quietly removed, questions left unanswered. They remembered everything. Mary stepped toward the altar, no longer trembling. "You fed on belief," she said, voice like thunder drawn from the earth. "You twisted sanctuary into slaughterhouse and called it sacrifice." The creature hissed, its voice fracturing across octaves. "Faith is obedience. Obedience is power. Power is eternal." Mary held aloft the largest shard of the mirror. In it, a face reflected, not her own, but Sister Agnes's, then Bernadette, then Teresa, one after another. All the taken ones. They were no longer lost. They were returning. From the broken walls came a sound like chanting, but not Latin, not the guttural old language used by Catherine's priests. It was Irish. It was Gaelic. It was the tongue of the first sisters, those who had crossed oceans with hope in their hearts, only to be consumed by a machine hiding behind God. The wind grew sharper. The creature's skin began to peel like parchment curling in flame. Its skeletal frame twisted, no longer able to maintain its human posture. Rosaries snapped. The teeth clattered to the floor like hail. Mary pointed the mirror shard at it like a blade. "You don't fear fire, you fear memory." She stepped forward. The creature recoiled. But there was nowhere left to hide, not in vestments, not in rites, not in holy lies. The nuns were watching now, and the age of silence was over. With each step Mary took, the shadows recoiled, not because of her strength, but because she had become something the creature could not calculate, a woman who had nothing left to fear. That is the one thing systems of control never plan for, not rebellion, not fire, but the soul that wakes up and decides, no more. The remaining sisters now stood not behind Mary, but beside her. Sister Clare held her broken rosary like a flail. Sister Ruth gripped a candle holder like a mace. None of them were warriors, but none of them were prey anymore either. Across the chapel, the altar cracked. Beneath it, stone gave way to soil. The foundation of the convent, both literal and spiritual, began to erode. Roots from ancient trees below burst through the tile like veins, like history itself trying to reclaim what had been taken. Mother Catherine, what was left of her, crawled backward, voice warping, face unraveling in spasms of grotesque revelation. "You don't understand. I was chosen. I was appointed. I was the system." Mary answered with the only truth that mattered. "And now the system is judged." A final chant erupted, not from the men in black, but from the women once silenced. It wasn't rehearsed. It came from the bones, from 1,000 forgotten prayers twisted into chains, now torn into war cries. The creature screamed. But there was no one left to listen, no bishop to protect her, no Rome to absolve her, no doctrine strong enough to silence the dead. From the rafters, dust poured like ashes, glass windows cracked from the inside out. The paintings of saints wept red, and the floor beneath Catherine collapsed, opening into the tunnels she once ruled, a descent not of punishment, but of reckoning. Mary stepped to the edge and looked down into the abyss. Her voice rang out, not just to the creature, but to all systems that hide behind robes, rituals, and scripture. You were not divine. You were not sacred. You were never chosen. You were hungry. And then she let go of the mirror shard. It fell, spinning like a coin dropped on a crypt's lid. A scream echoed from below, rising, splitting, then abruptly silenced. The wind stopped. The candles reignited, and for the first time in decades, St. Mary's fell still. Silence gripped the chapel. Not empty, not peaceful, but alert. The kind of silence that follows when a lie collapses and something older stirs beneath the rubble. Dust hung in the air like incense from a forgotten mass. Shards of mirror glimmered faintly on the floor. Sister Mary stood alone now near the altar, her breathing heavy, her eyes distant. What had just happened was not an exorcism. It was a trial, and the verdict had not come from heaven. It had come from memory. Around her, the remaining nuns began to stir, moving like those waking from a fever dream. Sister Claire wiped blood from her knees. Sister Ruth sat beside the cracked altar and wept softly, not from grief, but from release. Sister Margaret was nowhere to be seen. The creature had taken many faces, but the system required many hands. Mary turned toward the doorway. Light from the rising sun had begun to seep through the shattered stained glass. The figures of saints, once gazing down in solemn judgment, were now fractured, their colored bodies twisted into mosaics of warning. Holiness, she now understood, was not found in structure. It was found in what survives when structure is torn away. She walked the corridor slowly. The convent felt unfamiliar now, as if it had finally exhaled something it had held for too long. Doors hung open that were once locked. A draught flowed through hallways that had been still for years. The very walls seemed looser, as if no longer held tight by secrets. In the west wing, the orphans still slept, unaware, untouched, preserved, and that, above all, gave Mary the answer she had been afraid to seek. Not all of it had been darkness. Not all had served the hunger. Somewhere in the madness, there had been true care, true healing, perhaps not from Catherine, but from the others, from those who disappeared because they refused to become what the system required. He would not leave them unnamed. Not now. Not ever. Returning to the chapel, Mary gathered the scattered shards of the mirror, one by one. She placed them into a velvet satchel from the sacristy drawer. They were dangerous now, yes, but also sacred. Fragments of a truth that had bled to be seen. These were her relics, and she would carry them forward, because the world had more convents, more silence, more systems still unbroken. She didn't speak when she walked through the convent gates for the last time. The gravel crunched beneath her boots like bones, but she kept her gaze forward, past the trees, past the graveyard, past the chapel whose steeple now leaned as if ashamed. The sun rose behind her, throwing long shadows of the building onto the frost-bitten grass. Each step felt heavier, not from fear, but from inheritance. In her hands she carried the satchel of mirror shards. Around her neck she wore the simple wooden rosary that had once belonged to Sister Agnes. Its beads were worn smooth, not from prayer, but from the anxiety of young fingers rubbing them in the dark. It was no longer a symbol of obedience. It was a memorial. The road to town stretched long and silent, interrupted only by the distant call of crows and the low moan of wind curling through bare trees. When Mary passed the field where she had once hidden notes in the milk boy's coat, she stopped. The chickens were gone now, the coop abandoned. But the memory remained, small, human, and dangerous. That was how it always began, not with swords, but with secrets whispered into the right ear at the right time. She arrived at St. Joseph's by nightfall. The church was quiet, the doors locked, but Father Ryan answered her knock without surprise. His eyes took in her face, her cloak, the blood at her hemline, the ash in her hair, and he said nothing, only opened the door wider and stepped aside. They sat in his study by candlelight. She told him everything, not in fear, not in panic, in detail, with weight, with names, with dates, with every piece of truth she had collected while surviving a house that fed on obedience. When she was finished, Father Ryan sat back, hands folded, his face pale. "You've just accused a Mother Superior, a bishop, and half the diocese of conspiracy, trafficking, and murder," he said slowly. Mary nodded. "Not accused," she corrected. "I've proven." He glanced at the velvet satchel beside her. "And what do you want from me?" She looked him in the eye. "I want their graves dug. I want the names restored. I want every convent like St. Mary's opened, brick by brick, silence by silence." Father Ryan swallowed hard, then whispered, "God help us." "No," Mary said. God had his chance. The first record Mary submitted was rejected, not for lack of evidence, but for too much of it. The diocese clerk, young, uncertain, sweating behind his inkwell, read her statement and said the words she'd already expected. "These are serious claims, sister. We'll need to speak with the bishop directly." She was not a sister anymore, and she had no interest in speaking to a bishop. Instead, Mary went to the courthouse, then the sheriff's office, then the Milwaukee Tribune. Each place offered the same glance: startled, cautious, and finally deferential. Not because she looked powerful, but because she looked like someone who had survived something that should not be spoken aloud, a woman with no more fear in her spine. The Tribune was the first to print her story, not the whole thing. Names were redacted, quotes softened, horrors distilled into inappropriate conduct and possible impropriety. But it was enough to stir whispers in the pews, enough for donors to ask quiet questions, enough for a second story to follow, and a third. Within a month, 2 more women came forward, former postulants from a different convent in Indiana, both with similar stories of sudden transfers and disappearing novices. Their words were hesitant, half-spoken, always glancing over shoulders. But once Mary showed them the mirror shards, something shifted. One wept. The other said only, "So I'm not crazy." That's what systems like these count on. That isolation will feel like madness. That memory, cut off from recognition, will rot like a limb no longer receiving blood. But Mary wasn't isolated anymore. She was being heard. And that made her dangerous. Father Ryan stood beside her through the first 2 tribunals. He did not wear his collar. He had chosen publicly to side with the victims. The archdiocese quietly suspended him. His congregation split. But he did not waver. "I threatened excommunication," he told Mary after a late-night hearing. "And?" she asked. He looked at her like a man who had finally burned the last bridge behind him. "I told them I serve God, not Rome." The next morning, St. Mary's was cordoned off for investigation. By afternoon, 2 shallow graves were uncovered in the garden behind the infirmary. The wind picked up again, and this time the building did not resist. The bones were small, feminine. 2 complete skeletons, partially wrapped in decayed linen, found in a shallow trench beneath the herb garden, Sister Margaret's domain. The forensic report dated the remains between 1855 and 1857. No grave markers, no coffins, only silence and soil. It was proof, but it was also only the beginning. By the end of the week, a team of investigators, secular and ecclesiastical, was sent from Chicago. Publicly, it was framed as a routine review of St. Mary's operational history. Privately, it was crisis control. 3 senior clergy arrived under the veil of dusk, their black cassocks billowing like smoke as they stepped off the train and into the town that no longer trusted them. Mary watched from the courthouse steps. She recognized the look in their eyes, not concern, but calculation. They were not here for justice. They were here for containment. Inside the convent, the digging continued. More remains were found, 7 in total by the 3rd day. Some were missing teeth, others had fractures that didn't align with natural causes. All female, all within the convent's operational timeline. Word began to spread, and with word came resistance. The bishop issued a public statement. We mourn any souls lost in service to Christ, but we must remember that records from that period are incomplete and open to misinterpretation. Let us not slander the dead with wild speculation. Slander the dead? Mary felt something in her chest snap. These weren't wild accusations. These were bodies, teeth, hair, rosaries twisted around fractured fingers. She went back to the Tribune and handed over the full account, names, letters, journal pages, even Teresa's torn prayer book. She no longer cared about decorum or caution. If the church wanted a war of truth, she would burn every lie to the ground, and for every sister lost, she would speak louder. But exposure has its cost. That night, her room at Father Ryan's rectory was broken into, her belongings thrown across the floor, the satchel of mirror shards stolen, no valuables taken, just the truth, just the relics of what had been endured. It was not random. It was a message. You will be watched, you will be punished, you will be erased. But Mary had already faced worse. She stared at the broken lock and whispered, "Try me." The next morning, a letter arrived. No return address, no stamp. Just a single envelope slid under Father Ryan's door. Inside was a page torn from a missal. The words, "He sees what you do in secret," circled in red ink. Beneath it, in crude, slanted handwriting, "Leave it buried, or be buried with it." Father Ryan stared at the paper without blinking. Mary took it from his hand and held it to the candle's flame, watched it blacken, curl, vanish. "You're not afraid?" he asked, voice low. "I was," she said. "But fear's a one-time tax. Once you pay it, you don't owe again." By that evening, the Tribune's editor had received a threat of defamation litigation from the archdiocese. A lawyer in a grey suit arrived with an envelope of encouragement, $15,000, in exchange for a retraction. The editor declined. He printed a new headline instead. "Bones in the Garden. What St. Mary's was hiding all along." That headline cracked something open, not just in Wisconsin, but across the country. In Philadelphia, an ex-nun came forward with her own story, trafficking, penances, missing novices. In St. Louis, a former orphanage worker confessed he'd helped forge letters for girls who never left by train. One account became 10. 10 became 20. A national pattern began to emerge. The church responded predictably. Condemnation, denial, redirect, accusations of anti-Catholic bias, appeals to tradition, to sanctity, to God's inscrutable will. But it wasn't working anymore. Men were listening. The ones who had lost sisters to these cloisters, fathers who'd never seen their daughters again, brothers who remembered the letters stopping suddenly. Seminaries started whispering. Seminaries started investigating. For the first time in 100 years, the silence cracked, and it bled. But with exposure came danger. Father Ryan's church was vandalized. Judas was painted in blood-red ink. Ross, the altar. A fire was set in the vestry, extinguished only by miracle or luck. His bishop called him back to Milwaukee for a disciplinary meeting. He refused to go. Mary moved into a small boarding house under an assumed name, not because she was hiding, but because she understood now. This wasn't just about one convent, it was about a system designed to eat its own and leave no bones behind. That system was dying, and dying systems are always the most violent. By early spring of 1859, the ground thawed, and with it, secrets long buried began to rise. A federal inquiry was initiated, prompted not by the church, but by an unlikely coalition of newspaper editors, grieving families, and one junior congressman from Illinois who had read Mary's testimony and refused to stay silent. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He called for transparency, not just from St. Mary's, but from all cloistered religious institutions receiving public funds or land grants. No veil of devotion, he said in a speech that barely made the papers, should conceal cruelty, nor should any altar be immune to justice. The church called it blasphemy. The people called it courage. Investigators returned to the convent grounds, not under diocesan jurisdiction this time, but federal authority. What they found surpassed even Mary's worst fears. Behind the locked north wing, in a bricked-over chamber previously assumed to be a wine cellar, they discovered 3 iron bedsteads, shackles rusted into the stone floor, and a journal, half-burnt, bearing the handwriting of Sister Margaret. Pages detailing corrections, dosages, schedules, girls labeled by physical traits, blonde with blue eyes, compliant, dark-haired, resistant, perfect symmetry, worth twice. It was a ledger of human inventory, but one entry stopped the lead investigator cold. Order fulfilled, payment received, Dr. G satisfied, bishop informed. Margaret to administer tincture nightly. Catherine advises continued silence until shipment. There it was, in ink and flesh and bone, the full shape of the machine. Not just rogue actors, not just bad apples. A system, an enterprise, and worst of all, a hierarchy that had not only known, but participated. The press had a field day, but the Vatican moved quickly. Mother Catherine was summoned to Rome before she could be arrested. Officially, it was Frau Ahmed as a transfer, a new opportunity for reflection and service. Sister Margaret was found dead in her cell 3 days later. Poison, likely self-administered. No autopsy was permitted. Sister Elizabeth disappeared altogether. Her last known location, a ship departing New York under a false name, destination unknown. And yet, no criminal trial would ever be held, no formal conviction ever issued. Because when the accused wear collars, justice wears a blindfold far heavier than law ever intended. But Mary kept speaking, and the world kept listening. The walls had cracked, and something older than silence began to pour through. They thought it would fade, that time would soften the edge of what had been uncovered, that public attention, like a tide, would recede and leave the old structures untouched. But they miscalculated one thing. Mary hadn't stopped, and neither had the dead. By the summer of 1859, St. Mary's stood vacant, its windows boarded, its gardens overgrown. Locals refused to go near it. Children whispered about shadows in the tower. At night, some claimed to hear bells ringing, though the ropes had been cut. Others swore they saw faces in the upper dormitory windows, watching with hollow eyes. Men who had once defended the church now crossed the road to avoid walking past its gates. The place had become something else. Not haunted, condemned. Mary was invited to speak at a gathering in Chicago, an assembly of ex-clergy, reformers, and women who had survived similar retreats. She stood before a packed room of over 300, her hands steady, her voice cold steel wrapped in velvet. She didn't preach. She revealed. Line by line, name by name, system by system, she read from the letters, she displayed copies of the altered records. She played back the silence of the church in response to each documented horror, and when she finished, there was no applause. Only breathless stillness. Because what they'd witnessed wasn't just history. It was pattern. A pattern not confined to a convent in Wisconsin, but woven into the spine of every institution that claimed divinity to protect its own rot. St. Mary's had simply been sloppy. Others, more refined, still thrived behind polished walls and velvet drapery. But now, people were looking. Reporters began digging into other dioceses, missing novice records, sealed orphanage archives. Nuns transferred midwinter to locations that had no record of their arrival. The stories spilled outward, St. Louis, New Orleans, even Rome. And Benia, with each tale was the same mechanism. Control through isolation, obedience through fear, disappearance without answer. Mary wasn't trying to bring down the church. She was trying to wake the world. "You cannot save the sacred," she told one reporter, "if you're too afraid to touch the altar and see what bleeds." And behind her, others rose. Fathers, daughters, survivors. It was no longer her voice alone echoing in the void. It had become a chorus. And that chorus was becoming fire. But fire, as history shows, does more than illuminate, it consumes. And once St. Mary's was exposed, the flames spread, not just through the church, but through every structure built on silence. You see, St. Mary's was never just a convent. It was a prototype. A test site for psychological obedience, where human behavior could be broken, measured, and catalogued, where loyalty was engineered, not inspired, where confession wasn't about forgiveness, it was about leverage. Decades later, declassified documents would reveal a chilling connection. Early experiments in behavior modification traced directly to religious institutions. CIA memos from the 1950s referenced convent structures as ideal environments for isolative conditioning, their language cold and precise, words like sensory deprivation, penitential feedback, obedience modeling. But those documents were based on something older, something learned at places like St. Mary's. Mary suspected this even then. She'd seen how Mother Catherine ran the convent like a laboratory, testing limits, measuring silence, charting responses to deprivation. She remembered the punishments growing more elaborate, the confessions more detailed, the rituals more hypnotic, and the disappearances weren't just acts of cruelty, they were data points, which girls resisted, which submitted, which broke, and which were marketable. Because somewhere behind that stone chapel and rosary chanting was a marketplace, a black vein connecting cloister to capital. Mary's testimony had mentioned a man, Dr. G, who visited regularly, always with a briefcase, always leaving with a smile. Years later, in a Senate hearing on human trafficking, a witness described a physician who supplied high-ranking clients with women groomed from birth in isolated institutions. His name, Gregory IV, a French-American doctor with deep Vatican ties. These. The same Dr. G. You beginning to see it now? St. Mary's wasn't a tragedy, it was a blueprint. And when institutions realized that faith could create obedience stronger than fear, they scaled it, transferred it, from convent to clinic, from chapel to classroom, from stone walls to screens, because the goal was never holiness. It was compliance. And when a young woman is taught to kneel without asking why, she becomes more than pious. She becomes programmable. And Mary, in exposing it, hadn't just torn open a wound in the church. She'd touched the spine of something global, something that would twist to survive and strike back. They came for her at night. Not with violence, not with chains, but with silence. A deeper kind, one laced with power. It began with letters from the diocese suggesting rest. Then strangers appeared near her lodging, their faces always just out of view. Her mail was opened, her lectures were quietly cancelled. Publishers who once championed her withdrew support, citing concerns from above. She was being erased. The church didn't need to assassinate Mary Collins. They only needed to make her seem mad. It worked in stages. A neighbor reported her for disturbing the peace, though no noise was ever heard. A doctor sent by the city for a wellness check noted her increasing paranoia. Delusions of persecution, he wrote, fixation on institutional abuse. Soon after, she was committed to a sanatorium outside Chicago. The diagnosis was vague, her confinement indefinite. But Mary wasn't insane. She was dangerous. She had connected dots the world wasn't ready to see, had peeled back not just the veil of faith but of structure itself. The convent was a beginning, but behind it loomed a wider network, orphanages, boarding schools, asylums, all cut from the same cloth, all built not for care but containment. She began documenting again, from inside the walls of the asylum, smuggling out scraps of writing through the laundry service. She outlined how obedience was harvested through trauma, how language was weaponized, sin, purity, obedience, as tools of control, how entire populations could be taught to kneel to invisible forces simply by breaking the will early and often. And again, Someone listened. A nurse named Margaret Donahue, young, skeptical of church power, and haunted by her own years in a Catholic orphanage. She began copying Mary's notes, mailing them to a reporter in Boston. Quietly, carefully, another fire was lit. And this time, it was spreading faster. Because this wasn't just about religion anymore, it was about systems. About how power replicates itself, how trauma becomes tradition, how obedience becomes inheritance. Mary had mapped it. She had named it. And now, even locked behind asylum walls, she was setting off tremors in places far higher than any pulpit. But Mary knew what was coming next. They wouldn't let her live forever, not with what she knew, and not with what she had written in her final journal entry, one sentence carved into the wooden floor beneath her bed. "The altar is built from our silence.